Hello and welcome everyone. This is third and concluding lecture on political thought of Aristotle, and in the previous two lecture we have discussed his views on ethics or virtue, and also the way he developed the mechanism of classifying the prevailing constitution in the Greek city states, and his views on what is the ideal polity and what would be the best constitution to govern a polity in a manner where individual will realize his true potentiality or eudaimonia. So, in the previous two lecture we have discussed his views on ethics or virtue, and also his classification of constitution and his views on based constitution or based kind of a political regime, that is polity. In today's lecture we are going to particularly focus on his views on constitution and also his theorization of revolution and moral decay in the polity and the mechanism to prevent those. So, Aristotle appears to us more a kind of thinker who was devoted to retaining the status quo or preventing the radical changes in the polity than someone who will support a change or revolution, as it may appears from his theory of revolution. So, in the first part of the lecture today we are going to discuss his views on citizenship and also his views on a revolution or mechanism to prevent the revolution. And in the second part we will critically evaluate or assess the contribution of Aristotle in Western tradition of political thought and how his thought has a kind of determining influence in the ways human natures, political organization or constitution was thought about or theorized in the tradition of Western politics. So, he has abiding influence on the political thinking of many thinkers, particularly Hobbes, Kant, to a great extent Machiavelli, and also Hegel. So, we will do the critical assessment of Aristotle thought in the second part of our lecture today. So, if you look at the thought of Aristotle, we have a kind of glimpse of classical republicanism or civic republicanism in Aristotle's thought. And what is civic republicanism and what is so different about the classical civic republicanism? That is the idea on the basis of civic engagement or the citizens engagement in the day to day politics of the city or the polity. So, in Aristotle thought we will find a kind of glimpse into this classical vision of civic republicanism or civic engagement in day to day politics of state or polity, and the way such engagement shape the governing and also the notion of justice or good for that particular society. So, Aristotle wanted the citizen to take an active and full interest in the affairs of the city states. So, unlike the passive citizenship that we have now, where the role or the contribution of citizenship in the public political life is reduced merely to the periodic vote. So, in today's sense of the term, the relationship between state and the citizen is reduced to a kind of passive participation, that is once in 5 years, once in 6 year or 4 year as the constitution requires, citizen role is confined to electing their representative through the modes of vote. But Aristotle conception of citizenship is much more broader than that, which requires continuous engagement in the public life of the city states. So, what we have in Aristotle is a kind of support for active citizenry and not a kind of passive participation in the public life that we observe in modern democracy, where citizens' role in the public life is seen as limited to electing the representative. And then we think about civil society organization or groups, civil rights groups or democratic rights groups who will hold the ruler or those who are in the government accountable. Here the notion of citizenship is based on the continuous active participation of the citizen in day to day life of the city. So, he regarded this continuous active participation of the citizen as essential if rulers were to govern according to the constitution or rule of law. So, as we have discussed in his classification of constitution and also his ideal polity is to be based on the rule of law or constitution, that means the shared values or the shared norms that community collectively arrive at. So, the government should be based on those collective norms or the constitution which community decide. Now, who is going to ensure that governing or ruling is done according to those principles or those constitution? That requires day to day continuous active participation of the citizen. So, Aristotle argued that if rulers were to govern according to the constitution or rule of law or the shared values of the community, it is essentially to have an active citizenship, those who participate actively continuously in the affairs of the state. So, what we have in Aristotle is a kind of link between order and the notion of justice, and there is a kind of preference of order to ensure justice in the city. So, when we particularly discuss his views on revolution, we get to know more about his preference for the order or status quo and how to prevent the change, particularly radical change or transformation, which is necessary for a political life to flourish. So, without order, it is unimaginable to have a decent political life which will enable the ethical and moral life of the individual. So, here he, as you recalled our previous lecture, we have discussed that for Aristotle, the full or ultimate realization of human telos, that is their rational, moral and ethical faculties, are to be realized in the life of the city among the equals when they leave the associational life. So, this idea of jus politikon is to ensure that polity provide the condition for the individual to lead a flourishing life, to lead a happy life or eudaimonia. So, in Aristotle conception we find a kind of link between his notion of justice to the order, and justice or shared value of the community are the basis or the foundation of their polity. So, we have discussed that how in the polity constitution is the soul or the foundation which reflects the shared value of the community, and the governing of the polity should be based on that shared values or shared notion of justice or constitution which reflect or encapsulate that shared notion of justice and what is good for the community. So, thus he argued that each type of polity must act accordingly and guard against the excesses, particularly their weaknesses, if order or stability in the polity is to be maintained. So, what he argues is that the constitution reflects what is good for that particular community. Now, if the ruling or the governing is to be based on those agreed upon notion of justice or good for that particular community, each types of regime, and here you can recall the 6 types of polity that he argues, that is monarchy, which may pervert or eventually become a kind of tyrannical rule, then aristocracy, which can pervert or eventually turn into oligarchy, and then the best is the mixed constitution of polity with the aristocratic and democratic element, and which then may turn into or acquire the perverted form of democracy, which is the rule by many or the poor. So, all these 6 types of polities or regimes has their own weakness or the strength. Now, Aristotle argued that these each type of polity must act accordingly and guard against. Accordingly means their foundation, their basis of rule that reflects in their constitution or the purpose of ruling. So, they must act accordingly and guard against the excesses, particularly their weaknesses, if order and stability in the polity is to be maintained. So, without order and stability, the moral ethical life of the individuals or men, according to Aristotle, is unimaginable. However, he also argued that the rulers would eventually become corrupt and moral corruption would make civic or political life impossible, and that is true even today. When we think about politics, is a science or an art which enables us to have the sound judgment, which help us resolve our conflict peacefully without resorting to violence. Now, sometimes it happens because of the wider sense of injustice or the moral corruption, there will be little scope for sound ethical, moral, political judgment to resolve our conflicts, and that leads to strife, that leads to civil wars, that leads to revolution. Aristotle was aware about this gradual decay or degeneration in the polity and the eventual transformation or revolution. So, he argued that the rulers would eventually become corrupt and moral corruptions would make civic or political life impossible. That would finally lead to upheavals and revolution in the polity. So, Aristotle devoted a great deal of time in politics, that is his text, to suggest or advise the rulers on how to prevent revolution or radical transformations. Naturally, he generates a great deal of interest among the political thinkers who provide contradictory interpretations of Aristotle thought. So, whether he is arguing about ethical life, which is good in itself, or he is arguing about some kind of ethical relativism, where community or the specificities of the community and their historical context will determine what is good for their society. So, there is all kind of contradictory and different interpretation of Aristotle's thought. For some, he is a theorist of natural law or deontological ethics, that means ethics or the notion of justice that Aristotle had was good in itself, and on that basis he judges then different kinds of constitution and what is desirable, what is good moral ethical life for the human being. However, for others he was a kind of conventionalist and a theorist of ethical relativism. The second part of this lecture critically assess these claims and counter claims about Aristotle's political thought. Now, let us first discuss his views on citizenship. So, as we have discussed that for Aristotle, all the institution must have a purpose, or that purpose or goal will justify the existence of such institutions. So, we have discussed household or property or the institution of slavery, and how he justified it in the previous lecture before he gives a reason to the existence of polity. He regards polity or state as the collective body of the citizens. So, citizens are absolutely necessary for the effective rule in the city, and he has a very active notion of citizenship, as I have just discussed. So, this active citizenry play a very significant role in ensuring that power is exercised as per laws and constitution, and thereby ensuring order and justice in the polity. So, citizen has a very significant role in Aristotle's conception of polity or order or justice in the society to prevail. So, he is not someone who reduced the role of citizen to a kind of passive participation once in a 4 year, once in a 5 year, as we see in modern democracy. His views on citizenship are the best example therefore of the classical notion of civic republicanism. So, we have a responsibility if we want our polity to be governed according to the laws, according to the constitution. Now, without taking interest in or without participating in the public life of the state, to just criticize or just have opinion about the politics is not good. It will not lead to an ethical life. It will not help us to have more sound judgment about the political matters. It requires associational life, it requires engagement, it requires participation. So, therefore, in Aristotle you have a kind of glimpse of the classical notion of civic republicanism, and he presents a very thick, what is thick notion of citizenship? Thick notion of citizenship is in contrast to today's notion of citizenship, which is regarded as the thin notion of citizenship. You know, you are largely motivated or interested in leading your personal life, which is different from the public life in the city. So, you leave it for the politicians, for the political parties to decide about what is good for the rest of the society, and you pursue your personal self interest. So, you engage in the political matters, but only when it comes to electing your representative. That is a very thin notion of citizenship. In contrast, in Aristotle you have a very thick notion of citizenship, which is not just about electing, it is also about developing the capacity to rule. So, in Aristotle you have a very thick notion of citizenship and active notion of citizenship, which is not a kind of passive. So, he regarded this thick or active notion of citizenship or this responsibility of citizenship as a kind of very significant and critical for the smooth functioning of the state. So, this role of citizens in the city requires a very specific kind of training and education. And in the previous lecture we have seen that how we acquire this capacity by living associational life with others. So, the mechanism which helps the individual to develop right faculties to participate in the city state is to be acquired through associational living. Therefore, the knowledge of ethics or morality should be the guide, but it is not sufficient in itself. Individual must also acquire sufficient experience to have the sound knowledge about the political matters, which is essentially to perform one's citizenship duty or the responsibility of being a citizen in the city states. So, this idea of phronesis or the political judgment is necessary for the citizen to perform his duty of active citizen in the public life of the state. So, Aristotle argued that citizen must be free from the productive and manual labor to have the necessary leisure, and leisure is cultivating the reasonable faculty, or it is the life of mind where the creative pursuit of free time that is made available by the institution of slavery, who are to involve or engage in the productive labor within the household. And we have discussed these in previous lecture when we discussed about his idea on household, property and family. So, in Aristotle the citizen should have the sufficient leisure time or the free time to engage in the public political life in the polity. Citizens are to be free from the worries or concerns of managing the household affair or doing the productive and manual labor, and the leisure is different from our contemporary understanding of leisure, which is the pursuit of personal interest, what is good for us, which is different from the public or the political good. For Aristotle, the leisure is to involved in the public life or deliberate upon the matters that is related to the polity. So, what is good for the community? What is the just constitution? What is the just law? These are the matters which requires citizens to have sufficient leisure to deliberate upon through living associational life among the free and equal members in the city states. So, he had thus a very active notion of citizenship, which is defined as the ability to rule and being ruled in turn. So, those who are being ruled through rotation by the other citizens also have in them the knowledge or the judgment about how to govern. So, in that sense this is a very thick notion of citizenship, which is not a kind of passive indifferent attitudes to political matters as we say in modern large democracy, where citizens are by and large driven by their personal private interest. Once in a while they will have the opinion, but they leave it for the others to decide. Aristotle defines citizenship as something which requires the ability to rule and being ruled in turn. So, all the citizens are equally capable of ruling and being ruled in turn. So, it was not to be reduced to the periodic voting that we have in modern large democracy today, where citizens' role is reduced to electing their representatives. So, according to Aristotle, it is the intimate associational life and participation in the deliberation on good and justice for the polity that enables the individual to lead an ethical or moral life, that is the telos of the individual. So, the search for happiness or desire to lead a happy life requires, according to Aristotle, because man is jun politikon, a political social animal with the rational faculty and also in sense of justice or injustice. Now, these telos or the nature of individual can be fully realized in the life of the city states, and that requires individual living the intimate life, not a kind of indifferent, isolated, fragmented life who comes to perform their political task once in a while, once in 5 years, once in 4 years, but it requires continuous engagement, continuous participation in the public life of the city to hold those who are governing accountable. So, that is very different kind of civic republicanism or civic virtue that Aristotle was talking about. So, however, we have to understand that this conception of citizenship that Aristotle was arguing was limited to the male members in the polity alone. So, the large section of population, in fact the majority of the population who were women, slaves and residence alien, he denied them any citizenship rights. So, it is a kind of responsibility for the citizens which gives them certain rights, certain share in power or responsibility in governing the state. So, in fact, this conception of citizenship is to be limited to those who have the necessary leisure to participate in deliberating upon what is good and justice. So, in fact, it has to be limited to the male members who perform different tasks in the polity. So, when they are young, they should perform military tasks. When they are mature enough, they should be the statesman or the politician, and when they are old enough, they should become the priestly class. Now, all these roles are limited to the same section of people who at different stage of life will perform different kinds of roles in the cities, and that denies, that exclude a large section of population who are women, slaves and residence aliens. So, he has a very thick or active notion of citizenship, but it was limited to a same set of male household honor in the Athenian society. And he justified slavery, and he thought that this involvement of slaves in manual and productive work was necessary for the citizen or the male member in the Athenian society to have the necessary leisure to devote exclusively to the matters related to the public political life of the cities, and how he justified it we have discussed later. So, in his scheme of thing, only those members who have the necessary leisure time, free from the financial worries or the worries about managing the household, only they should be given this power or responsibility to play an active role in the life of the city or in the deliberation about what is good for the polity. So, this it is a very thick or active notion, but it is a very limited notion of citizenship that we have in Aristotle. Now, we discuss his views on revolution and the causes and remedies of revolution that Aristotle argues. So, his account of revolution is fascinating for numerous reasons, and one of the reason is to do with that in Aristotle what we have is more about how to prevent the revolution than the ways and means to overthrow the existing regimes or existing polity. So, it would be perhaps wrong to call it a theory of revolution. In fact, the argument that Aristotle present is how to retain the power and how to prevent upheavals or revolution from occurring or from challenging the status quo in the polity. So, in that spirit he even advised a tyrant, which is the worst form of or most perverted form of polity. So, the fascination with his theory of revolution often leads many to compare his idea with the Marx, which is absolutely wrong, and we will discuss it how. So, it is nonetheless fascinating, and it argues more about how to prevent revolutions or mutinies than the ways and means to overthrow the existing states, which is even tyrannical. So, thus for Aristotle the role of political judgment or the knowledge of politics, which combines the knowledge of ethics with the practical wisdom, is to maintain political stability for justice to prevail. So, the whole idea of Aristotle's theory on revolution is to prevent decay or degeneration which lead to transformation in the polity or regime. So, his theory of revolution, which is also known as stasis, has two steps or parts. First, he described the situation when it is no longer possible to lead a well ordered political life. So, the purpose of a polity or a regime is to give the man or the citizen a scope to lead a political life, and political life is the most desirable life for the individual to realize his true potentialities, to lead a human life, to lead a moral ethical life. That is possible only in the life of the polity, and therefore, as we have discussed, the pursuit of personal interest or the economic interest is seen necessary, nonetheless less significant or subordinated to the life in the public and political community or to the public political life in the polity. So, the purpose of a polity is to enable those conditions where man would lead a life of realization of his own true potentialities. Now, when a situation occurs where it becomes possible impossible for man to lead such political life, that is the first step towards this moral degeneration or revolution or stasis, as Aristotle calls it. And second step of such moral decay and degeneration is the breakdown of the existing political structure, which eventually leads to a strife and bloody civil wars. So, if you look at the modern revolution or radical transformation in different polities, you can explain or understand it better through this idea that revolution happens or the radical transformation occurs when it becomes impossible for individual to lead a political life. So, that is the first step. Unless it is checked or addressed there, it would lead to the eventual upheavals or transformation in the polity. So, by and large Aristotle saw these changes or evolution or stasis as evil and provide an elaborate mechanism in politics to prevent it. So, whole purpose of Aristotle is to advise the rulers or the governing class how to prevent these radical transformations and revolution. And it was in this spirit of self preservation for the politics that he advised even the tyrant, which is the most perverted form of regimes, as to how to retain power, how to maintain the status quo and prevent any revolution. So, his theory of revolution, or rather how to prevent a revolution, was rooted in the social or the historical context of Athens. And as you know that like Plato or Socrates before him, Aristotle was also addressing to the wider sense of injustice that was prevailing among the Athenian citizens. This was result of the moral decay, the rise of the sophist and a kind of ethical relativism. And there he was trying to address these instability or uncertainties of his time, which led to the factionalism between democrats and oligarchs, which were alternating power one after the other, which lead to murder, usurpation of power and wider sense of injustice or moral corruption in the city states. So, his understanding of revolution can also be understood through this social historical context of Aristotle, where there was a kind of periodic rotation of power among the democrats and the oligarchical faction in Athens, and both of them were justifying their retaining of power or responsibility or wealth of the city. So, the democrats argument was that if all men are equal, then why ruling or governing should be limited to the few, and the oligarchs argument was these few are wealthy, noble, and therefore has the right to rule. So, this contesting position or alteraction leads Aristotle to devise the mechanism to address different claims or competing notions of justice, and thereby ensuring order or stability in the polity, which is necessary to lead a political life, which is necessary for individual to lead an ethical life. So, it was not rooted therefore in the economic disparities or inequalities. So, for revolution in modern times, particularly in Marx, we find the justification for revolution or radical transformation or civil war rooted in the economic disparities or economic inequalities. But for Aristotle, the roots of revolution or upheavals is to be traced in the wider sense of injustice than in the purely economic disparities. So, economic disparities may be the reason, but overall the reason for change or revolution is rooted in the notion of injustice, which vary from society to society, community to community, and ages to ages historically. So, in contrast to Marx, who would argue much later that the economic disparities in the society would lead to the eventual transformation in the polity, Aristotle's argument was that it is rooted in the wider sense of injustice that prevails. So, if the society is divided into the classes, where there is just a few who usurp the power and use it for their own benefit, there would be natural resentments and revolt against such usurpation by the many who consider themselves as equally capable or free and equal member in the society. So, the roots of revolution is to be traced in this wider sense of injustice rather than economic disparities alone, as Marx would argue much later. Now, what is his advice to different kind of rulers or governing class? So, Aristotle provides very specific advice to each of the 6 types of regimes and polities that he discussed in Politics, his text. So, there is a kind of specific advice. So, here again Aristotle appears to us as a more kind of neutral observer or a kind of empirical thinker who is not taking any moral position. His only responsibility is to advise different kind of rulers, be it aristocrats, oligarchs, tyrants or monarchy or democracy, to how to maintain status quo, how to retain power, and in such advice he makes a specific advice to the specific kind of polity. So, the advice may appears to us very simple and to some commonsensical, but it is hard to practice in the actual politics, in the actual arrangement of the ruling and the polity or governing the state. So, his advice was to observe the strength and guard against the weakness to prevent revolution. So, for each type of polities they will have their strength and they will have their weaknesses. Aristotle's advice was for these rulers to retain power, to maintain a status quo, they must observe their strength, but guard against their weakness to prevent degeneration, to prevent upheavals and revolution. So, his advice to monarch was to develop the obedience of law. So, when a monarch, and the justification for monarchy is when you have in the community one man who has the superior knowledge than the rest to know what is good for the whole community, then monarchy is justified. And now to prevent monarchy from degenerating into tyranny, monarch must inculcate among the citizens or the subjects a obedience to the law or unquestioning submission to the laws of monarchy. So, for a monarch to prevent tyranny or degeneration of his regime, he must develop the obedience of law among the subjects and guards against the charlatans and demagogues. So, they may also dupe the king or the monarch by presenting themselves as knowledgeable in some skills without really having those skills or abilities. So, a monarch to rule wisely for the benefit of the community, he must develop in the subjects obedience for law and also guard himself from the charlatans and the demagogues. He advised the tyrants to and when the monarchy degenerate into tyranny and there are many tyrants, now to maintain the rule or retain in power, the tyrants must develop this dual tactics, that is to divide the opponents. So, there will be constant conspiracies against the tyrants, and tyrants must be aware of his opponents and try to divide them to retain in power, and also should adapt to the moderate tax of a decent monarch, and this way a tyrant can retain in the power. This advice is much similar that Machiavelli would give to his prince a millennium later. So, similarly he wanted aristocrats to ensure the well-being of all and judicious distribution of resources. So, if it is limited to the few and works for the interest of these few alone, then it would lead to oligarchy and eventually to the mob rule. So, for the aristocrats, which is the rule by the best few, those who have the knowledge and the merit to govern the society for the benefit of all, is desirable, and for them to retain in the power they have to ensure that their rule should not be limited to the interest of few. Once it is only for benefiting or protecting the interest of the few who are in the ruling, then it is oligarchy, which eventually lead to mob rule. So, he argued therefore that the aristocrat must ensure the well-being of all and the resources of the state should be shared among everyone and not just for the few. He argued that democrats might enter into danger if they adapt to the distress caused already to the traditional wealthy ruling elites in the state. So, for the democracy his advice was that they should not do harm to those who are noble, who were wealthy and from the ruling class, who are now sharing power with the many, with the many basically means those who do not have wealth, the poor. So, the democracy if it wished to maintain the stability and order, it must ensure that those who have the wealth or those who are from the nobility should not be put under distress or further distress than was caused to them already by ensuring the power is shared by everyone, by many. And there is also a danger in democracy about a kind of general contempt for law and possibility of demagogues usurping the power. So, to ensure durability of democracy or stability of democracy, democratic aspiration of many needed to be counterbalanced by the virtue or characteristic of the aristocracy, and that he argues in his defense of polity as the best form of rule. So, the opposite of this advice that he gives to democrats, he gave to the oligarchy. They should rule in the manner that makes their ruling balance the interest of the few with the democratic aspiration of the many. So, the oligarchs has to ensure that the interest of the few should be counterbalanced by the democratic aspiration of the many. So, Aristotle argued that the monarchies or kingship could degenerate into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, democracies could easily give way to mob rule and are prone to demagogues usurping power. So, he regarded a mixed constitution which will combine the virtues of aristocracy or oligarchy with democracy as the best system of rule and the most stable form of rule. And with a sizable number of middle class, Aristotle regarded polity as the most stable and just form of rule. So, he gave advice to different kinds of rulers to ensure the stability, to maintain the power. However, he regards polity as the most just and the most stable system of rule, because it is a mixed constitution, combines the interest of few who are meritorious or have the knowledge of ruling with the democratic aspiration of many, and with the sizable number of middle class who are open to reason or to debate, and then ruling on the basis of virtue or ethics will ensure the durability and the stability of political rule. So, these advice of Aristotle to the rulers on self preservation and political stability continues to echo in the writings of many political advisors and political theorists even today. So, even many political advisors to different kind of regimes today derive inspiration from this advice that Aristotle gives to different kinds of rulers, to different kind of political regimes. So, that is on my take on Aristotle's view on revolution. Now, we move on to overall assess the contribution of Aristotle to the political thought and tradition of political thought in Western tradition. So, clearly first things that appears to us, Aristotle expand the notion of politics that we have in Platonic conception. So, it appears to be much different from the Plato's, which is rightly argued by many scholars was about apolitical or anti-political, because the focus of Plato's political philosophy is to ensure harmony of existence. Now, if there is harmony of existence, there is no role of politics. The role of politics is when there is competing interest, when there is divergent opinions, how to mediate among those divergent competing opinions to arrive at certain common good, certain common notion of justice. Now, that requires the knowledge of politics or the sound judgment, which is the mixing of ethical notion with the practical wisdom of a particular community. So, clearly there is a kind of radical shift in understanding the role of politics and why politics is the master science according to Aristotle. So, it is much more scientific, empirical and pragmatic in Aristotle's conception. However, this scientific, empirical and pragmatic conception of politics should not be construed as Aristotle is arguing about politics which is devoid of any ethical or moral norms. It is often done in today's sense particularly, which politics is seen as more about acquiring the power, and how power is to be acquired and how it is to be distributed is regarded as the political matters, or requires the political debates and discussion about how and whom power is shared and how it is distributed. In Aristotle conception, as in Plato, politics requires an ethical sense, and there is a kind of balance between the ethical norms or the ethical understanding with the political specificities. So, he combines the ethics with the knowledge of politics in a very unique way, and that leads different scholars to interpret Aristotle differently, which we will discuss in a minute. So, his classification of man as jus politikon has become the basis of political organization. So, we as a human being are naturally social and animal being who realize his or her true potentialities by living associational life with others. So, in the household also, where there are unequals according to Aristotle, the relationship between man and wife, or parents and children, or men and slaves are of unequal relation, and that is a kind of proportional inequality. And life in the city is life among the equals, and the most ethical moral life therefore is possible only in the life of the city, when individuals take interest in the public matters of the polity and have the necessary leisure to devote to the public life. So, his classification of man as jus politikon has become the basis of political organization. He regarded man as rational, moral, ethical being, and it is the telos of his existence, the full realization of which requires the associational life in community with others. So, it is in the political community that man learn the virtue of political judgment by combining the knowledge of ethics with practical wisdom. So, there could be some merit in his theory of proportional equality that argues that equal should be treated equally and unequal unequally. However, his defense of slavery is morally and ethically unacceptable and repugnant from today's sentiments, and he could not go beyond the biases of his society and age, even when he characterized men as rational and moral beings with a sense of justice or fairness. So, there is some kind of telos that he argued about the man, and yet he denied it to the full or equal level among the women, slaves, and those whom he considered as the barbaric. So, similarly, his support of the subordinate roles for the women who could realize their full potentialities in the sphere of the household alone is very problematic and unacceptable today. So, there is many feminist critique to Aristotle idea of discrimination on the basis of gender. In contemporary discourse on moral philosophy and theory of justice, there are opposing camps with regards to interpretation of Aristotle's political thought. Fred D. Miller regards Aristotle as a natural law theorist, and he argues that for Aristotle there is some transcendental or universal ethics that set the standards to judge the nature of other constitution. However, others have characterized him as a conventionalist, conservative, and the theorist of ethical relativism. So, Aristotle's theory, particularly on ethics or virtue, is regarded as general and universal, and his notion of political judgment is this combination of this general understanding of ethics with the specific wisdom or the practical wisdom of the specific community. So, that is there is an inherent innate sense of justice in man which he could realize fully only in the polity by living associational life with others who are equals. This has influenced the thinkers like Immanuel Kant, who in turn influenced John Rawls' understanding of a theory of justice, his text. So, there is a kind of deontological basis of ethical understanding or understanding of virtue in Aristotle according to these thinkers. Although Rawls regarded Aristotle as consequentialist. Consequentialists are those who argue that the justification for ethics or justice is in its outcome, the consequences of its application. However, Rawls or deontological theorists would argue that justice is those principle of governing that is just in itself, that does not require any further justification for its justness. So, in Kantian ethics certainly we will discuss which shapes the John Rawls theory of justice is based on this reading of Aristotle as someone who argued for a transcendental or universal theory of ethics. Now, in contrast to this kind of reading, there are communitarian scholars who are critique to Rawls' theory of justice, such as Alastair MacIntyre, present Aristotle as the theorist of community specific, historically rooted theorist of justice, who preferred the role of communities and conventions in determining what is good or just for the community. So, for these thinkers, Aristotle appears to be rooted in the community or the historical specificities of the community to determine what is good for that society. And there is the plausible reason for such readings of Aristotle when he decides about different constitution and different constitution reflecting different notion of good and justice for different communities. So, the basis of such argument is that Aristotle argued that actualization of ethics require the practical wisdom of the specific community. So, there is a kind of knowledge of ethics which is general or universal, but its actual realization requires the practical wisdom as well, that is specific to the community, to its historical context, and therefore communitarians would argue Aristotle as a thinker of ethical relativism, or the notion of good which is specific to the community differs from community to community. However, both these interpretations are partly correct. So, as we discussed, Aristotle is not just providing us a theory of justice, he is a quintessentially a political thinker who combines the notion of politics with justice and how human being can realize his true potentialities in the life of community. However, these theorists would extract only those part that suits their justification for their particular or specific notion of justice. There are still others who regard Aristotle as the founder of classical republicanism. They focus particularly on his emphasis on civic engagement, which was based on proportional equality and combined the optimistic aspiration of the humanism and classical degeneracy in human affairs. So, the classical notion of civic republicanism was based that only few are capable of governing. When we allow everyone in the business of governing, it may lead to degeneration or moral corruption. And now, how to prevent that? To prevent that, it is necessary to give only those citizens who have the leisure, who has the free time to devote in the public matters. So, in the Aristotle, many scholars find those reflection of classical notion of civic republicanism. Aristotle argued that through the rule of law and constitution, moral decay and corrupt practices could be thwarted and the full realization of human potentiality become possible. So, he allows individual to realize his true potentialities by ensuring that governing and ruling is done according to the rules and the constitution, and how it can be done when there is the active participation in the public life of the city. So, the controversy that surrounds the interpretation of Aristotle as an ethical relativist or conventionalist or naturalist or deontologist is based on the projection of Aristotle as the theorist of justice. Although there are traits of both in Aristotle writings, so he talks about specificities of good and justice that is specific to a particular community, but he also talks about ethical notion or virtue which is universal, which is transcendental, and sound political judgment requires the knowledge of both the ethics and also the practical wisdom. So, the different interpretation is rooted in regarding Aristotle merely as the theorist of justice, but he is quintessentially a political theorist who argued that political knowledge could enable man to lead a life of eudaimonia, and it is to be fully realized in associational life in the community. So, Aristotle rescued politics from the philosophical speculation and esoteric sciences and gave it a more pragmatic and scientific basis. He regarded politics as the master science, the purpose of which is to not only give us the knowledge of the objects or the world which we live, but also how to lead a good life, how to make polity a better place or a more just and ethically or morally more just order or just mechanism of governing. So, this possibility which we have discussed that applicable only to the human affairs. So, in the life of nature among the other objects, the question of ethics and morality does not arise. It is applicable only in the human affairs because it is through these notion of ethics and morality that we can make our life better. Individually, we can lead a more virtuous life or ethical life, realize our true potentialities, and also collectively we make the governing more just, more ethical, and that is the whole purpose of politics for Aristotle. So, it is to be learned according to Aristotle by combining the knowledge of ethics which is general, universal, with the practical wisdom that is particular to a specific community. So, his views on man as a social and political animal, zoon politikon, as we have discussed, become the basis for all social and political organization, and men realize the true and full human potentialities through associational life in the community, as we have discussed again and again. So, his notion of citizenship as ability to rule and being ruled in turn becomes the hallmark of the relationship between state and citizens, and man learns the art and science of sound political judgment only in the community and thus could lead a life of eudaimonia. So, therefore, in Aristotle what we have a kind of unambiguous link between ethics and morality. So, the whole purpose of associational life, be it in the household or in the city state, is governed by this purpose in human life to lead a virtuous life, to lead an ethical life, and that continuous search for leading a virtuous life and thereby realizing the true potentiality becomes possible only in the life of the city. So, therefore, it would be wrong to either project Aristotle merely as the pragmatic or scientific theorist devoid of any ethics, or merely as the ethical theorist. So, he has a kind of balance between the transcendental ethical notion of justice to the practical specific requirements of the community, and this again comes to the overall theoretical premise of Aristotle, that is about the golden mean, that is the human being are posed or posited in a manner where he is neither a beast nor a god, not someone who does not know anything or someone who knows everything. So, there is always that element of uncertainties or realms which transcend our knowledge. Now, within that limits how to lead a virtuous life, how to create a polity which would be just, which will enable the moral and ethical life of the individual, is the whole task of politics, and therefore why he regard politics as inexact science, yet it is very productive science necessary for leading a good life for the individual. And we see how this relationship between ethics and politics becomes problematic in later thinkers when we will discuss Machiavelli, Hobbes and others. So, that is all in today's lecture. You can refer to some of these texts to understand Aristotle ideas, and you can also read the politics, and there are different ways of reading politics. So, it is divided into different books, and it is argued that he wrote different books at different point of time, and it is most likely what we have now is the lecture notes of his disciples. So, you can read it in your own ways to know more about Aristotle views on politics or his classification of constitution and other topics that we have covered in this course on Aristotle. But what I have covered today, for that you can refer to these texts like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, political thinkers. Will Durant again gives you a good entry point into the philosophy of Aristotle. Murray, Forsyth and Cephaliza is again a very good text, and Ellen James Rand, particularly to understand his views on revolution and stasis. So, that is all in today's lecture. Thanks for listening. Do share your comments and feedback. Thank you all.